All right, good morning all to agents. I'm Kevin Lawrence. I'm the Director of Training and Marketing here. And today we're going to be going through the RPA again, the CAR RPA new for 2022. And this will be our fourth installment of our 5-part series. And of course, we'll be joined by Lauren Noack in a second or two. But before we get into today's presentation, I want to bring on Cameron Alley from Clearview Mortgage. And Cameron's going to give us a little update on what's going on in mortgage land today. Good morning, Cameron.
Good morning, Kevin. How's it going?
Very well, thanks.
Wonderful, wonderful.
All right.
All right.
So, yeah, and I've got, in case you need it, I do have the 10-year Treasury graph that I'll pull up for you, but take it away.
Perfect. Perfect. Yep. So mortgage rates have continued their extremely volatile movement. That's for sure. Last week we were talking about rates going up, and this week we were talking about rates going down. So if you hit that that month, if you see that month tab there, one month.
Yeah.
So if you guys check that out, see like rates literally just up and down, up and down. So when it comes to locking in your clients, it's all about strategy, knowing what data reports are coming up, which ones are going to look good, which ones are going to look bad. And we obviously, with these weekly webinars, we are always keeping our eyes on the market. So we're trying to save your clients money because the more money we save them, the easier they're going to qualify, the happier they're going to be, and the more referrals you're going to get. So as of today, rates are looking really good again. And they just released October mortgage data, and this data is pretty crazy. So pending home sales jumped 7.5% from September. With a 0.25% increase in rate, which obviously shows that even with rates increasing as they were in the previous month, demand is still extremely high. And then another crazy data piece is that rent for single family homes surged 10% in September from last year, which is the highest increase ever for rent year over year. So this will continue to increase the demand for renters to become homeowners. So with, programs like 3% down for first time home buyers and, just a regular conventional loan with 5% down, a lot of these people are going to have opportunities to get into homes, especially, if we're writing up very attractive, good, short loan contingency offers. So, basically I don't see it slowing down as far as demand for home sales. And closed sales in October also increased as inventory has started to kind of open up a little bit more with homeowners looking to upgrade and using that new equity to buy larger homes, and then renters obviously looking to buy their first home, since it doesn't make sense to pay more in rent for if you can buy a home.
Right.
So 2021 existing home sales are estimated to exceed 6 million, which would be the best performance in 15 years. So I think that's 2006. So that's pretty incredible that even with limited inventory, we're looking at having 6 million homes sold in 2021. And that's obviously only existing homes. So as supply chain issues are settled out, we expect to see, a huge increase in new home builds that are going to be closing. I actually just had one close yesterday for a new home build, and it's coming down to the last second on those homes right now because we're obviously having problems with getting what we need in. For example, on this one, we had a water heater that wasn't installed, so we couldn't get the appraiser to come and check it out and sign off on the appraisal. So I called around and figured out who had a water heater in stock, and we actually got a water heater in the house. The builder paid for it and got the loan closed on the last day. So, so
well done, Cameron.
Yeah,
pro move right there.
Yeah, but and then another thing to touch on those, just so you guys know, since those are obviously good clients to target. We can do a 90-day lock with no rate adjustment at all for new home builds, new constructions, which is obviously very good right now, because you can't really lock a 30-day on a new construction, even if you think that's going to happen, because if something doesn't show up, you need some leeway, because with how quick rates are going up and going down, if we're on the upside and that lock expires, your clients could be looking at a big check at the end of that to pay for that extra rate increase. Our max lock is 180 days, but that does come with a rate adjustment. But just wanted to let you guys know we could, we have extremely long lock periods if needed, and we can also lock them as short as an 8-day. So, a lot of flexibility there. Some more news as far as jumbo loans. We just had a program that got released called Prime Jumbo Interest Only. So basically we can do jumbo loans up to 3 million interest only now, which obviously means that the payment's going to be a lot less. If you have somebody who is more savvy as far as investing their money into the market, or they have other things that they want to invest their money in, you can kind of keep that cash flow going, but still get them the home that they want. So that's a really powerful tool. That obviously is the max LTV on that is 80%. So on a purchase, that'd only be available for 20% down, but still very, very powerful tool. And I know every week we have new realtors on, so I want to remind you guys, we have for conventional loans, no mortgage insurance under 90% loan to value. So usually you have mortgage insurance from, unless you're putting 20% down, you're going to have mortgage insurance. We can do a 10% down payment with no mortgage insurance. So that's going to save your client, anywhere from $80 to up to $300 a month, depending on their credit score. And then last but not least, obviously every week we try to share our weekly wins here just to show, what we're doing for our clients. We got obviously 1-day and same day approvals there. Literally every single loan that we get, we're pretty much going to get a conditional approval within at least 24 hours. So right away we can get your clients, what we need and make sure that we can clear that loan contingency. And we got a 3-day clear to close purchase there, 15-day refi, 11-day refi, 6-day purchase clear to close. So just want to put that in your face every week and let you guys see, what we're doing for your clients and what we can do to help you get more referrals. But I know you guys got a long webinar with a lot of good information coming up today, so I'll leave it at that. And obviously, if you guys ever need anything, have any questions, have clients that aren't qualifying, you can reach out to me or anyone on the team anytime, and we are here to help you guys. So
yeah, they're not just there to help, they're there to make you look like you are the rock star that you are. Yeah. So hit them up. All right, thanks a lot, Cameron. I appreciate that.
You got it, guys. Have a great week, everybody.
All right, thank you so much, buddy. We'll talk to you soon.
Yep.
All right, so now I will bring on our liaison for compliance. So this is Lauren Noack. Lauren, good morning. How are you today?
Good morning. Good morning. I'm well, thank you.
All right, perfect. So Lauren is the owner of TC Advantage. She's also our compliance officer. And so take it away, Lauren. She's going to be going through the part 4 of our RPA series. So we're all ahead of the curve when this switches over sometime in the middle of December, right?
Yeah, exactly. So the date now, they have put up a firm date as the 14th of December. So that is when you should be able to expect to see it in zip forms and in Glide whenever you're generating your documents and things like that. And so keep an eye out. I feel like I'm coming down with something that day. I think it might be a little crazy for TCs everywhere, but no, that's the plan. So I wanted to, this webinar will probably be a little bit different than ones in the past, because we're going to be talking about the addendums and the advisories. And so we're going to be spending a majority of our time, let me just bring the screen over here, in viewing the actual documents. Almost everything we're talking about today on your screen right now is a copy of the updated or the purchase agreement that's going to be released. And so everything that we're going to be talking about today is going to be here on page 4. Just in section 4 here up on the top, all of these property addenda and advisories and everything that will may or may not be incorporated into the contract all in this section. So what I wanted to do first is normally I navigate kind of verbally to get everybody a copy of this contract, but what you can also do is view copies of all of the documents that are about to be released. So I wanted to kind of walk everybody through that in real time. This is logging on to just CAR.org. You go up here to Transaction Center, and then you click on Standard Forms, and it'll probably ask you to log in. And this will take you to the Standard Forms section. From there, you're going to go to this link Form Revisions and New Form Releases. And we've done this in the past where we've clicked on this RPA draft, but now what's available is the December release of new and revised forms. And this is where we're going to direct you today. And so when you click on that, you're going to see a couple of things, and I'm just going to walk through kind of one by one. The first option that you have is to click on this quick summary guide. And the one thing to remember as well is that when you're in CAR forms, for whatever reason, it will navigate you within the same page. So if you are viewing a document and you close it out, you're going to have to go back to the website. So just keep that in mind. There's been many frustrating scenarios of like trying to go back to this page and you close it out on accident. So keep that in mind. This quick summary is really powerful, really helpful. I recommend you view them for every release that comes out in June and December, but this one specifically, it's going to list all of the forms that are new, that have been revised, and what has been changed and or discontinued. So you'll see up here that this is the plan for the week of December 14th. And we're going to go through a couple of them, but this will give you a summary of these are the purchase agreements. So we've been talking about the residential purchase agreement, right? But there are also all of these additional purchase agreements that have been updated to match what this residential purchase agreement is going to look like. So it's going to be familiar across the board. And then when you get down to some of these ancillary forms, you'll see all of these new forms that they're coming out with, what their codes are, some of these additional forms that have been updated, some changes to forms that you're already familiar with. And so it's really important, you know, everybody thinks, oh, well, I know what the repair request is going to look like, or I know what the counteroffer is going to look like. There are some small changes that have been made to these forms that you really should take a look at more in depth. And so this gives you kind of that quick summary of what to expect. These forms have all been renamed, and then these have just been kind of tweaked or updated. Most of them are just, oh, they changed the date down at the bottom of when the forms were. And then this lists the ones that have been discontinued. So this is the summary. It's really helpful. I recommend everybody look through that. The other thing that you'll find, this is a link to the full purchase agreement. This is what we've been going over in all the webinar series. But the other thing that's really nice is this link here. These are all of the other additional purchase agreements. And what's nice is all of these additional documents that are available to view and download, these are all the redlined versions. And so what that means is you can see in red, you know, this is a notice of default purchase agreement, but you can see where they've made these specific changes and tweaks. And so other than the obvious kind of layout and things like that, it helps as you're going through of like, oh, these are the things that have been changed. And this helps really draw your attention to some of these changes. So these are all the different purchase agreements that have been updated. So you'll see even like the vacant land purchase agreement that now has a grid. Some of the changes that we've discussed in the residential purchase agreement, you'll see as well available in even just the vacant land purchase agreement. So it's structured across the board.
That's really helpful, huh? I love
yeah, and so then aside from that, you also have these options for all the new forms that have been created. And it's kind of misleading because these links, they list some forms, but there's also additional forms that aren't on that list. So I would still, like, don't just rely on that. I would still kind of click on it and look at, like, this is an additional purchase agreement. It shouldn't be in here, but it just because it's kind of listed, it's not limited to just what's listed. There's sometimes additional things.
Got it.
This is the group of the forms that have you know, kind of the bigger changes to them that you should be more aware of. And again, these are all redlined versions. So you'll see here the notice to perform, notice to buyer to perform. Everything in red here are all the changes that have been made. And so this is really helpful to see. It's really important to know as you're going through the transaction, some of these updates that have been made, because these are, again, this affects not just the residential purchase agreement, but there are 63 additional ancillary forms just mentioned in the purchase agreement. So not to mention all of the ones that are additional outside of the RPA. So it's important to know how to navigate these forms, and, you know, things that you're kind of used to doing a certain way. These are all getting changed. So this is really helpful to have all of these different versions. And again, things like, you know, the property questionnaire and things that you're kind of, it's not necessarily in the contract specifically, but as you're going out through the transaction, there are certain things that have been added and changed and, you know, reformatted a little bit. So keep that in mind. I know some agents also have kind of templates set up. If they don't use maybe zip forms or Glide, some agents have like in their DocuSign for the TDS or the SPQ, they have little templates set up for the yes or no boxes. You're going to want to go through those and pay attention, because these things have changed sort of significantly. So having said that, what we're going to focus on today is going to be the addendums and advisories. And it's grouped into 3 sections: property type addendums, other addendums, and then your advisories. And so first, I kind of want to address the difference between the two. When we're talking about addendums, we're talking about adding terms or conditions to the contracts. These are things that need mutual agreement and signed by all parties to be applied to the purchase agreement. And then your advisories are not necessarily contractual, but they deliver sort of this specific information to a party, to both parties, make sure everybody's aware, kind of brings this additional focus to the contract. Another thing that you won't necessarily see here in this section, when it comes to, you have the addendums listed, but you don't have the AEA listed, which is the amendment to existing agreement. And that's simply because you don't have an agreement yet. This is the offer. And so you can't amend an existing agreement because you don't have one yet. So only the addendum is listed here as that option. Okay, so we'll start in the first top section. And these are all sale type specific addendums. And so the first 2 are actually replacing entire purchase agreements. So there is no longer going to be a probate purchase agreement or a manufactured mobile home purchase agreement. The other thing that is going to be confusing and difficult for people to kind of wrap their head around is the way that they've decided to sort of rename some of these documents. So for example, the probate agreement addendum, the little code at the beginning of it, it used to be the PAPA form, PAPA. Well, now it's PA-PA. So you'll see that throughout all of these specific addendums, is that it has -PA, and that's how you know it's a purchase addendum. And so I'm gonna, I'll open up here some of these addendums. So we'll start the probate purchase addendum, and you'll see here that in red is just the hyphen. So that's all they've changed as far as the code goes. But what CAR noticed for the probate and the manufactured home is that the contracts were essentially the same with just a few minor exceptions. And so they've just put those all into these addendums instead. And obviously they have these sort of reference question marks here, which they're going to, again, this is just a draft. So the final version will have these things completed, but you can see here what those addendums will look like. There is also the manufactured home, or the tenant occupied, which we've talked about in previous webinars. This is taking place of the tenant occupied addendum. Sorry, I skipped ahead here a little bit. This was just more of a summary of the probate and the manufactured home. The probate addendum does remove the liquidated damages and mediation terms out of the contract. Again, that's because the courts have the final authority anyway. So it sort of overrides that element in the RPA in this addendum. So it's really important to use this addendum when you have a probate transaction. And then the manufactured home purchase agreement, that one has a special section here, which you'll see in blue, where you have to designate who pays for these additional costs. Because remember, in the RPA in section 3 in that grid, that is all, this is where your allocation of costs is going to go. And so these are additional items that are kind of need to be agreed upon, but aren't necessarily going to be found in that grid because they're circumstantial. So, those have been added. And then the other addendums, it's going to be such a tongue twister day between addendums and advisories and all of this stuff. So bear with me here.
You're doing great, Lauren.
So this tenant occupied addendum, like I said, we've touched on this before. This used to be the TIP, or tenant in possession, and it used to only be applicable when the tenant was remaining in possession on the property. This document has now been renamed to a tenant occupied property, and that's just when the offer is being made or when acceptance is being made, there is a tenant in the property. The tenant may or may not be staying in the property, but you need this additional addenda regardless. And so it's important to note, and we've kind of touched on this before, but this first section here, it assumes that the tenant is going to be remaining in possession. That's the default term. Is that the tenant will remain, everything gets transferred over, that sort of all gets addressed in the following pages throughout. But if the tenant is not going to remain in possession, you need to check this box stating so, and then there is additional remedies for maybe it's supposed to be delivered vacant, but if it isn't delivered vacant, these are the options that the buyer can take to help remedy that. So just keep that in mind. The default is that the tenant remains in possession, and you have to designate if they do not. The next form is the tenancy in common. This is a new form. In fact, it's a new group of 3 forms. And CAR was noticing that tenancy in common was becoming more and more popular. And so they created this sort of series. Our main focus will be the purchase addendum element. And this is kind of what I was talking about, because you will see there is this TIC, which is the tenancy in common form, dash PA, which is the purchase agreement or purchase addendum. See, okay. And then the TIC dash OA, which is an ownership advisory. And then the FD, the TIC FD, which is a financial disclosure. So there are 3 new forms related to this tenancy in common, but the one that is noted in section 4 in the purchase agreement is this purchase addendum element. And so again, this is not an agreement to form a tenancy in common. You should still have that done separately. but this specific addendum allows for some of those agreements specific to a tenancy in common type purchase to be incorporated into the purchase agreement. So if you experience this type of sale, if you have experience with these types of sales, read over this addendum very carefully, whether you are the buyer or the seller, or representing buyer or seller. It's important to know about this form. And then the other new form that has been created is for the stock co-ops. And so this is, again, becoming more and more common, or becoming something that a lot of agents even specialize in, where there's sometimes like a senior living facility or a community that will be a stock co-op. And so they created two forms in this series. Again, this purchase addendum, and then the OA, which is the ownership advisory. And so this co-op form, this addresses your the need for possible board approval, and also what might be required throughout the transaction. It doesn't necessarily make it a contingency, but it does assign timeframes to it. And so it's important to know that if this addendum, again, we are adding terms to the contract. So these terms need to be agreed to. They can also be adjusted or modified. So you'll see here in section 4, just kind of zoom in a little bit. So here for board approval, if that does apply, the buyer has 10 days after acceptance to get all the necessary documentation. And then it will typically take 45 days after acceptance, they'll have to get that board approval. You can, of course, extend that time, modify that time, but it's important to know what those defaults are. There's also elements here that you need to agree to on transfer fees. Who's going to pay that? Sometimes those are separate, and it's a co-op. So this is something that is really helpful. If you have no experience in a co-op sale, you can kind of come here and view that and see kind of what it's all about. Let me pull up if they have here's an example of, this is the ownership advisory. And again, as an advisory, this is not changing terms or anything like that, but this is really helpful, at least for me or for other agents that don't really have experience in these types of sales. It's kind of like a quick little guide of like what to expect and what are these and how are these different. So it's nice to have these available to be presented to your clients as well, to know what they're getting into.
Oh, that's a great point.
And then of course the final addenda that is specific to a property type is the completed new construction. And so this one, it used to be, I think the code was like the CAR RPA or something like that. And so this, they renamed it a little bit, but this is if you have a new home build, a new property, and it's already been built. Typically, this will be if somebody has purchased, a builder's purchased a lot, or somebody tore down a whole home and built one on it, or you purchased vacant land and built just one kind of specific home. It's not necessarily like a development that's being created. So, but this goes over the specifics of the construction and acknowledges kind of some additional terms and elements that apply to a new home that's just been completed. It's difficult with this one to attach it to the purchase agreement, because you can see there are elements here that if you're a buyer and you're making this offer and you check, you write in here that there's this, new construction addendum, completed new construction addendum, you're not going to be able to fill it out because there's things here that you're not going to know as the buyer or the buyer's agent. So this would be something that would be incorporated into a counter offer, and something that would be provided. This is not a disclosure. I've seen in a lot of transactions where a listing agent will counter out, oh, we'll provide this information, this this addendum with the disclosures. That's not acceptable. As the buyer's agent, you should require that this all gets reviewed and agreed to prior to going into escrow, because this is not a disclosure, it is an addendum. So keep that in mind as well. Okay, so any questions about some of those, the property type addendums that are specific to those types of sales? Again, if it's not one of these items, then it probably has its own purchase agreement. So notice of default, vacant land, commercial, all that kind of stuff. If it's, but if it's something that is just sort of these one-offs, there's probably this purchase addendum available.
Right, and just want to remind those that are new, we do have a chat feature. So if you do have questions, you can just put it in the chat and we will do our best to answer that.
Yes. Okay, so then these other addendums, this is section B here, that lists some of the other addendums that might be included when you're writing up the offer, or things as the listing agent to see if they've been checked off and incorporated into the offer. The first is obviously your standard addendum. This is, again, adding terms. If you have throughout the offer, as you're filling things out, we've discussed in past webinars that the TOA, or text overflow addendum, will automatically generate when you run out of room on a line in the contract. You don't have to then check that there is that addendum added. That doesn't count. That's not for that. And again, you can tell because the code here is ADM and not TOA. So those are separate. Don't worry about incorporating those into this. The other addendums that may or may not be incorporated are this backup offer addendum. And this can be incorporated. Typically, you'll see it in a counteroffer where the listing agent will then provide it to the buyer once the offer's been submitted. But a buyer's agent can also submit this with their offer, and they can sort of set those terms and include it into the contract, again, with their offer. It's important to note this backup offer addendum is a two-parter. Not a lot of people use this addendum, and then in addition, a lot of people that do use it don't use it correctly or utilize it as the tool that it is. And so the first section of this addendum clarifies, puts kind of constraints on this backup status, and it notifies both parties kind of what we're looking at here, where you're ranked in backup position, and make sure that all parties are sort of on the same page. The second half is utilized. So you would sign this first half, both buyer and seller, and say, okay, let's say you're backup position number 1. And then the existing escrow cancels. I'm going to scroll here real quick, please hold. Existing escrow cancels, and now you are no longer backup position number 1. Now they're going to go through with your offer. So the first part of this, the seller signs saying that, yes, the prior transaction, all prior transactions have been canceled. You are now moved up to, main contract status. And the second line here is really important. The agreement is now in full force and effect. So what this does is gives you essentially an acceptance date. So because what happens is when this offer is a backup offer addendum is signed and incorporated, a lot of times the seller will sign and include the contract along with it. And so then if you end up becoming the main purchase agreement, you have a contract that's been dated for maybe 2, 3, 4 weeks prior. Well, obviously that's not going to be your acceptance date. And so a lot of agents don't use this or deliver this. And so as the TC, we're like, when did we start? What is our acceptance date? Because so many other dates in the contract are calculated based off of that specific element. So it's important to note and have in writing when this has become official. So keep that in mind for backup offers. The other document addendum we've touched on previously as well is the SWPI. And the title kind of incorporates it all already. This is incorporates a lot of elements. You may only use one of the elements in this addendum, but it's for septic inspections, well inspections, property monuments, and propane tanks. Propane tanks were added, I think, a couple of years ago, but that's probably the newer element. So just because a property doesn't have a septic doesn't mean that you don't use this addendum. The other thing to note is that this addendum is an allocation of costs. It's a very flexible form. And so if, as a listing agent, you receive this addendum with the offer, look it over carefully, see what the buyer is saying they will or will not pay for, what they're asking the seller to be responsible for. As the buyer's agent, you should know the area, you should know the property that the offer is being made on what does and doesn't apply. It's really frustrating if you're the listing agent and you get something where an agent is just like seller all the way down, and you have no idea what box you're checking or what applies or what doesn't. Each section for each element says check all that apply. So if something doesn't apply, don't check the box. You're just making more work for the other agent to have to counter back out of like, it doesn't need a certification, or it doesn't need, a bacterial test or things like that. So make sure that you're very specific and very well versed in what may or may not apply to the property. And again, each one has something that is different. And because it's an addendum, again, we are adding terms and elements to the contract.
Yeah, and we've seen, lawsuits arise from septic inspections and well inspections. And so these are really important to cover.
Exactly. Yep. So, and if you have an out of area listing agent, maybe they're listing for, a friend or family or something like that. Maybe they don't know, but if you're the buyer's agent in the area, you're more well versed. Make sure your buyer is aware of, all of these things. Sometimes an out of area agent is just going to look at the MLS listing before them or in properties around them and be like, I don't know, I'll use that information. So don't necessarily rely on that. Have a conversation with the agent. Are you aware of any septic system, any wells, any, anything like that? And find out, if they're like, oh, I'm really not sure, it may or may not, I'm not from the area or something like that, then you'll know that you need to do more research. I know it's really hard in markets like this where you have to, submit your offer within seconds of viewing the property, and it's really competitive, and you just want to, maybe the buyer will take on all this burden, or you don't want to ask for these sort of things. But it's really important that you do this research and you know what you're getting your client into.
Right.
The other ones, this short sale addendum, remember, we're still talking about addendums. This one is not new. This is one that we've been utilizing for a while now. Hopefully we won't get super familiar with these like we were in 2008, 2009. But you'll see they've made a couple of tweaks here to the form. But again, just keep in mind there are default timeframes and terms associated with this specific type of sale. And so if a short sale applies to this transaction, if you know it as the buyer's agent, add it in. Make these terms work for you and your buyer. If you're the listing agent and the buyer's agent didn't include this, add it into the counteroffer and make these terms protect the seller. Again, these are tools. These have been generated by CAR and CAR Legal to be as neutral as possible. And so depending on who you're representing, there are ways to make these elements work for you. That's what's so frustrating about those stupid Zillow transactions, is they use all of their own stuff and their own addendums and their own forms, which have very clearly been written and reviewed to benefit them only, and they don't care about the other side. So These forms provided by CAR are an attempt to be as neutral as possible.
Yeah. Ugh, Zillow, gross.
Yeah, I know. So the other addendum that is an option to check on the purchase agreement, we talked about this on the last webinar as well, this court confirmation addendum. Again, when you think of court confirmation, you typically think of probate, but that is addressed in that probate purchase addendum. So you might not necessarily have a probate, but you might still need court confirmation. And so that would apply in things like, bankruptcy court, or if there's divorce court, family court, that sort of a thing. It just is just that blurb as far as court confirmation, is needed if you have a court date, that sort of a thing. So it's just kind of to bring everybody up to speed and make sure everybody's all on the same page for that. And the last two forms that are available are forms that have been renamed as far as the code goes. But these are forms that are not used as much as they should be. They're so helpful. And again, I've said in a lot of past webinars, the most dangerous thing for a real estate agent is a blank line where they can fill in whatever they want to. And so what I see a lot is in regards to 1031 exchanges. And you'll get these terms written into the counteroffers where it's like, oh, buyer agrees to, cooperate with seller's 1031 exchange at no cost to the buyer and blah, 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 blah. Okay, well, that's the same form. There's a form for that. And it's the seller's intent to exchange. And there's also the buyer's intent to exchange. And it says here in section 3, cooperation, buyer agrees to cooperate with the seller's exchange. And then it clarifies even further for both parties to say that the buyer cooperates with the seller's exchange, but the buyer has no right to the property that the seller is exchanging for or to, and vice versa on the buyer's intent to exchange. This is something that is really helpful in keeping everybody on the same page. The other thing that's important to note on this form is that the default for failure of that exchange transaction, right, is that the transaction, let me highlight, 4A, the transaction shall close without an extension. So the default is that, yes, we're doing a 1031 exchange, but if I can't get that lined up, or if we can't do that in time, the file is going to close anyway. We're going to close escrow anyway. That's the default. So keep that in mind. If you can have an extension agreed to in advance. You have other options where, oh, if we can't do it, we're just going to cancel the transaction. There are a couple of other terms that you can apply to the transaction, but keep in mind the default is that, okay, if we can't do it in time, we'll do it after, but the escrow will close still at that same rate. And again, there's one for the seller intent and there's one for the buyer intent. So these are really useful forms. The one thing you don't want in your contracts is ambiguity, and any opportunity you have to clarify a situation, to set parameters, to create these boundaries and guidelines is going to be beneficial to everybody, because it gives parameters for cancellation, for notice to perform, all of these things. It helps with enforcement of this contract. So be as specific as possible. Utilize these forms. If you didn't know they exist, you do now. Okay, so those were most of the other. Anybody have any questions on the other, any of the other addenda? There are things here, there are other boxes, which again makes me really nervous, and just check a box and fill in whatever you want. But this is something, if you're a buyer's agent and your office has a addendum for their contracts, or you might see receive an offer. We don't have, Alta doesn't have any addendum like that changes the terms of the contract, but I know some of the other offices do, or brokerages do. So you might receive an offer that has that box checked. That's where that would be incorporated into the contract. And again, keep an eye out for documents like that, because a lot of times they just get signed blindly. But if it says addendum, it is changing the terms of the contract. And if it is an addendum provided by the other side, it's going to be benefiting them as much as possible. So there is nothing statutory or required about signing those addendums. And it's perfectly acceptable as a listing agent to counter that out. And if it's not included on the contract here, you know, sometimes you'll get it after the fact and with the disclosure package, and they'll be like, oh yeah, sign this addendum for my office or something. You can say no. It is not written in here for the seller or to incorporate the terms of that addendum. And so keep that in mind. That's kind of what the other lines are for. But really avoid them. Don't get fancy. There's probably a form for whatever you're trying to do. Okay, so those are the addendums. So moving on to this last section of the advisories. There are standard sort of advisories that are already bundled in the purchase agreement. And they're ones that we've kind of become immune to, or they just kind of like disappear in the background, but they're actually really important advisories. They're things that people should be aware of. And the biggest one that I feel like kind of gets overlooked the most is this buyer inspection advisory. It's the last page after the contract or after the RPA. And it used to be 1 page, but it is now 2 pages. But no additional information has been added to it. So they've just kind of the format is a lot easier to view. But this is really beneficial to a buyer because it outlines everything. When we're talking about your investigation contingency and you have 7 days or 17 days, as is the new default in the contract, right, to complete. Let me pull these up here. I don't want to give anybody like scroll whiplash. Hold on. Okay. When we're talking here about the investigation of property, and the default is you have 17 days for acceptance, and then we go to, I believe it's 8C. I should list it. No, it's section 12. Okay. Okay, so this element here in section 12, it goes into more details about all of these things that are included in this investigation contingency, right? And you'll see down here, it will list, you know, your home inspection, your lead-based paint, wood and pest, anything about the land, improvements and things like that. And anything else that wasn't listed above. And see this buyer inspection advisory, which is the BIA. And this form, now 2 pages, lists all of these additional types of investigations and things that a buyer should be looking into. These are things that are all important when you're purchasing a property. Sometimes these get incorporated in like your buyer presentation, and like, you know, it can get lost on buyers. But there, you know, are things, airport noise, you know, if there's local cemeteries, all of these things are part of that investigation contingency. And so it blows my mind when so many of these agents cut your investigation period down to like 5 days. Like there's a lot of stuff in here that you may have been like, oh my gosh, I didn't even think of that. You know, I know living in Southern California, we lived probably a good 30-40 minutes away from Disneyland, but we could hear their fireworks. And for the first week or two, it was like, what is going on? Like you could hear these loud booms and you didn't know what was going on. And it was like, oh, those are fireworks, you know? So these are like little things that you're not aware of. And it might take you, you know, more than 5 days to investigate some of these additional elements. So keep that in mind. Let buyers know that this is all that's incorporated in that investigation.
That's so true, right?
Yeah. I'll get off my soapbox on that.
No, I lived by in San Clemente for a long time, and that's right next to the Camp Pendleton Marine
RV base.
Base.
Yeah.
You can hear stuff going down like a lot of times.
Right?
You just you can hear weaponry. It's like that's a thing.
Exactly.
I don't know. Some people that might freak people out. Who knows?
Yeah. And so, I think it's not, the investigations is not just a home inspection and a termite inspection and maybe pulling permits. There's a lot more to keep in mind. So, and it all falls under that contingency timeframe. So don't be careless with signing it away when, oh, we did our home inspection and termites not a part of the contract, so it's fine. Make sure your buyers know what their options are. And then this same for the wire fraud advisory, and then your FHDA form. It's all the same content. This is the wire fraud one. It's just spaced out a lot more. It's a little bit easier to read, which is nice. That's kind of been their whole approach to the new purchase agreement and all of these ancillary forms in general, is just making it something that that is readable. And then the final form is the newer one, the CCPA. This is the Consumer Privacy Act. You have one for sellers that gets signed with the listing, and one that gets submitted with the offers. And the current one is one full page, but the new one is half of that. So you'll start to see this now, where this is what the CCPA form is going to look like. And usually it comes, I think, right after the buyer inspection advisory and the contract, but they really just kind of condensed it down and gave more kind of reference points, as opposed to being really kind of lengthy in their descriptions and stuff like that. So don't be surprised. The form didn't get cut off. It just is shorter now. So those are ones that are advisories, specific advisories that are bundled together. And then some of the other advisories that are optional here, here for you to check for things that may or may not apply in the contract. The first one is the Wildfire Disaster Advisory. This is going to drive me bonkers, and I'm sure a bunch of other people. For whatever reason, they flipped the code. So everybody that is familiar with it has been referring to it, the WDFA. Now they decided, well, it's the same form and it's called the same thing, but now we're going to call it the WFDA. So good luck with that. But it is nice because now there is no longer a section for filling in, the county, the city, the township, all of that kind of stuff. It just tells the buyer, check on your own. Just look up all the local information about it. But it's really nice here because it gives these updated links, and this is something that even if there is a property that on the natural hazard report shows up in a wildfire area, obviously you want to use this. But even if it's not, even if it's near it or around it, it's just good practice to let people know, because these boundaries are constantly changing. And as we have longer droughts, as there's changes to the climate, you might purchase a property that's maybe next to a wildfire area, but maybe in 5 years' time, maybe it's now incorporated into that wildfire area. So it's important to know, have this information available and presented. Again, and this is for buyers to be advised and to sign. So it's not a disclosure, but it can be incorporated with the disclosures if it's not part of the contract on its own. Then you have your trust advisory. The trust advisory, again, I want to remind everybody that this is for sellers that are a trust, and it's for whether they're revocable or irrevocable trusts. I get a lot of pushback, more than I feel like I should, for this form because it's like, oh, this is just a living trust. It's a husband and wife. Doesn't matter. Line 1, sentence 1, word 1, property is held in a revocable or irrevocable trust for the benefit of the people named as beneficiaries in the trust. That's it. So if you have a trust, doesn't matter what type, use the trust advisory. And what this does is it lets both parties essentially know, even though the property is in a trust, what is the seller still obligated to do? What are they required to disclose? What, what sort of things can either party expect when dealing with a trust? And then also what the exemptions are. When this form first came out, it was the other way around, where they listed all the exemptions first. And true to form, when you have a lot of words to read, people skim, and they said, oh, these are all the things I'm exempt from, the end. And then they skipped over the part that they weren't exempt from, so they switched it. So figuring out what a client is and is not exempt from, a seller, would be on the second page here. And so it tells them what they aren't necessarily required to provide. And then the other advisory is for the REOs. And this one, again, the red line version kind of highlights it a little bit for you. It's mostly the same as the previous version. They just added this element paragraph here about gas and hazardous liquid pipelines. So otherwise, everything else kind of, again, advises both parties on what to expect when dealing with an REO property. And then your statewide buyer and seller advisory. This one is not a statutory disclosure. It is really commonly used in all of the disclosures, but if it's not incorporated into the contract, you might not necessarily get the SBA in the disclosure package. It's important to know there are elements within this disclosure that are statutory. For example, Megan's Law, that disclosure is incorporated into the statewide buyer and seller. Some additional elements about supplemental property taxes, things like that, they have their own separate forms. So if you don't have the statewide buyer and seller in your contract, you can still get those statutory disclosures via separate forms, but everybody just uses the statewide buyer and seller. But just know it's not necessarily required. It is a chunky boy. It's 14 pages. You have your 7 different categories it's broken down, and there's 63 different topics. And not much has been added or changed to it, but keep in mind there is this sort of directory, if you will, on all the different types of important elements to be advised for both parties. And this is, again, throughout the state of California, what people need to know about. So again, nothing was really added. It's just kind of format wise, a little bit easier to read. Then you have your short sale information advisory. And again, this is separate from your short sale addendum. When you're talking about the short sale addendum, you're adding terms, parameters. This is an advisory. So you are just advising on what to expect. What is a short sale? What are the options? What are the consequences? What are, how can things go wrong in here? What are things to keep an eye out for? And so this is, again, something that is helpful to have in those transactions. And then the final advisory here is the probate advisory, which again is really going to be confusing because this code for this form is the PA, and it automatically attaches to the PA-PA. So we're gonna have fun with this one. But again, this is an advisory. So same thing like with the short sale, this is just advising on what to expect in a probate, what the exemptions are, what the requirements are, and that sort of thing. And then again, it also reiterates that there is no liquidated damages or mediation because the courts decide those elements. Okay, and so those are all of the addendums and advisories that are listed here in section 4 as an option to incorporate into your offer, into your contract, negotiate, that sort of a thing. But there are additional addendums and advisories that are incorporated outside of the RPA that may be an element, may not. And so some of those are the assumed financing addendum. That's going to be really kind of specific to that type of financing option that's utilized. So just know that there is an addendum for that. The additional signature addendum. Let me close out some of these here. This one is kind of a pain. It's really only helpful if you have like more than 4 signers. But the difficult thing with this one is that you have to list specifically all of the documents. And so if you try and use this for your disclosure package or something like that, you're going to have to list every single document that is being signed by these additional signers. And then of course there's an element here that if this additional signature is being applied to something that includes liquidated damages or arbitration, then they would have to agree to that separately as well. So this is another form that as the TC, it's just easier to add 4 digital signatures instead of having this form every single time. You still need to get signed. The other addendum that may or may not come into play later in the transaction is the buyer early occupancy addendum. CAR's official stance is don't do it. Do not occupy early. But if you have to, please use this form. Again, it's not recommended, but it's important to have this in place. This is for 29 days or less. If it's going to be longer than that, then you would use a separate form, the interim occupancy agreement. But this is just an addendum for that short-term time frame if the buyer is occupying early. The other one we're familiar with, speaking of 29 days or less, is the SIP form. And this one they renamed a little bit. It used to just be the seller in possession addendum. And because I think the CAR committee gets paid by word on these forms, they just added more clarification. It is the license to remain in possession. So keep that in mind as a listing agent. If your seller is remaining in the property, the buyer, new owner, is granting that seller a license. And so there are certain terms and requirements that are associated with that. So make sure that you review this, that you see what is being negotiated and agreed to. Again, 29 days or less. If your rent back is for 30 days, you use the residential lease after sale, RLAS, is right here. If it's intended for 30 days or longer, use this other form. The other one is the AOAA form, which we kind of touched on a little bit in previous webinars. This is changing up a little bit as far as the process goes. If a buyer is assigning their authority over to another entity or adding another individual, that sort of a thing, there is a time frame for which they are authorized to make that request. But again, they're changing the terms of the agreement. They're adding these new terms. And so it needs mutual acceptance. Both parties need to agree to it. And this really outlines the specifics of what's required. The contract gives you your parameters on when you can make this request and submit this addendum to make these changes. And then this form goes into more detail as far as what is required. So any documents already delivered. So let's say we have a husband, he wants to add his wife onto title, and it's within those 17 days of acceptance. The wife is the assignee. And so the assignee acknowledges that the buyer's given them all the documents, and then the assignee has to initial copies of all prior documents, and it only has to be the first page of all of those documents. But at that point, what's the difference? So we really do want to get these assignments done as early in the transaction as possible, because that's that much less of the paperwork that needs to be signed. So it's nice, because it used to be they have to sign all documents, and now they've kind of specified that they just need to initial the first page, and that's up here. Assignee shall initial, the first page of each document. So, but keep that in mind, that is a requirement on this form. Your lease, rental, mold, and ventilation addendum, that comes obviously with your leases. These are terms that need to be agreed to by both parties on if there's any sort of responsibility or remediation or anything like that that's been done on the property. This is a form that you want to use. And again, this is for leases, so you have your tenant landlord. And then the DID, which again was renamed, it was previously the RID, or receipt for increased deposit, but agents are no longer receiving increased deposits. So this is just an addendum acknowledging and verifying the delivery of any sort of increased deposit. And again, it incorporates the use of this form. If liquidated damages is initialed in the agreement, then when you sign this, it is also incorporated and applies to this deposit amount as well. And then your two advisories, your buyer homeowners association advisory. Again, we're advising the buyer that the property has a homeowners association, what to be aware of, what to know, what to expect with those sort of additional elements. And it's also fairly lengthy on what to know if you're purchasing a property in an HOA. And then the last one is the market conditions advisory. And this one should be used more commonly. And I see it incorporated in a lot of the disclosure packages, but it's important to review with your client and to let them know. They've added some additional terminology in here about multiple offers and this type of market with increased demand and that sort of a thing. So be aware of some of these possibilities when you're in this contentious market. And that's it for me. Those were kind of all the addendums and advisories that we're going over today. Does anybody have any questions?
Let's take a look in the chat. I don't see any questions, but I know that people will have questions.
Yes. Again, it's a lot of information. I really, really recommend that you guys navigate over to these CAR forms and review these drafts and look over what's been changed and updated. Again, we've talked about kind of a lot of these changes throughout the past webinars. And so these things are really helpful to come back and look at now, because these weren't available for the past webinars. And so we now have things that we've talked about previously, for example, contingency removal. And you can see in here how the contingency removal, they kind of broke it up. They added additional lines for contingency removals, different options. And same thing, the notice to perform, or things that we have addressed again previously. Your seller multiple counteroffer, your seller counteroffer. You can go in here and see what to expect, because this is coming in 2 weeks, whether we like it or not. And this is all that's going to be available. And when you as an agent go to fill out a multiple counteroffer or a seller counteroffer, and you're like, where do I go? What is all of this? And now you can see in advance to be prepared of what to expect and what your clients are agreeing to, and so that you can advise them properly and in all of these different elements. Oh, this is now a 2-pager too. Ugh.
I know, lovely.
I don't know why. It looks like there's a big gap right here. So hopefully they'll fix that before they release it, because
I know.
Yeah.
I do recommend everybody print these up and have them, physically. I don't know about you guys, but I think that would help you learn a little bit better. That's kind of a technique I use. I like to print things up, take them, make notes on them. That's just kind of my learning style, but I think that might help a lot of the agents as well.
Yeah, exactly. And there's also, again, if you want more extensive classes on the purchase agreement, I think CAR still has some available, but if you go to the RPA draft link, same way we navigated to the new forms and revisions, if you go to that draft link, it'll take you to the store for training. And then I think, let me look here. It's not listed on here, but they have the books, which I get every year. It's included when you take the forms trainer course, the 8-hour forms trainer course. But I have like a spiral bound book of all of the 63 ancillary forms, all the different purchase agreements, everything, so that I have it in paper form in front of me. And I think you can purchase it separately, but it would be here in the CAR store. So yeah, I think it's like $150 or something like that. But I reference that thing all the time. It's so much easier than logging into zip forms and creating a fake file and pulling up the document and so it's but I agree. I check out the red line versions. Those are really helpful. Sign up for the classes if you can. And so that's it for me.
All right, perfect. Well, very, very thorough as usual, Lauren. Thank you very much. And a lot of thank yous in the chat. So really appreciate you coming on our webinars and informing us about all these great new changes that we get to live with.
Happy to do it.
Right. All right, great. And so let's see, super quick question from Joyce. Is there a new addendum for buyer asking for a seller's credit to closing costs?
There is not an addendum, but it is written into the new purchase agreement. So there is a section, I believe it's at the top of page 2, where it is its own dedicated spot. And let me see here if I can pull it up here. So this is the new purchase agreement in the grid. And so right up here at the top on page 2, you can see there's a spot for the seller credit. That's what she was asking, right? Not a buyer credit, but seller, obviously seller credit.
That was perfect. Yes, seller credit.
Okay.
All right, cool. So
that's the one.
That answers your question, Joyce. Nice question. Thank you very much. So yes, Lauren, again, thank you for coming on the webinar. And are you going to be coming on our webinar next week, or are you going to take a week off?
I will try to do it next week, because the following week the contract will be out. So
Sure.
I think we'll do it again next week and just kind of go over all the things that we haven't gone over yet. All of the kind of sort of how to cancel a contract, how to what are some of the little tweaks and changes that maybe don't fall into anything that we've addressed so far. So
got it.
I think we'll do that.
Okay, excellent. Well, in that case, we will see you next week. And agents, get out there making a great week and a productive week. And we will see you next Wednesday on the webinar. Bye-bye.
Bye.